All right, strap yourselves in for this deep dive because you guys have sent in some seriously head-scratching stuff. We're diving into the Syrian Civil War and, well, specifically, this out-of-nowhere rebel offensive.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
Yeah, we've got these excerpts from a Spanish language report, and honestly, it's pretty wild. The rebels took Aleppo, a city of 2 million people in just 3 days. Like, how? Expert seeker, break it down for me. How is that even possible?
Well, it's definitely a major twist, and to get it, we gotta rewind back to the start of the Syrian Civil War, back in 2011 when the Arab Spring uprisings kicked off. See, President Bashar al-Assad, when he was faced with peaceful protests, his response? Not so peaceful. It was brutal, a full-on crackdown.
It's like a messed up echo of his dad's regime, right? History repeating itself.
Sadly, yeah. But what makes this even crazier is something Assad pulled early on. Shocked everyone, honestly. He released a ton of jihadist prisoners.
Hold up. He let out extremists. Seriously, why would he do that?
It was a calculated move. Some might even call it Machiavellian. By throwing these extremists into the opposition, Assad basically made the rebels look terrible. He knew the West would hesitate before backing a group that now included these dangerous elements.
Wow, that's some seriously long-game thinking. But it also created this whole mess of factions, right? Can you help us figure out who's fighting who in this whole thing?
Absolutely. It's definitely not a simple two-sided war. On one side, you have Assad's regime, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah from Lebanon. They're this Shia-aligned power bloc.
Okay, so a powerful team behind Assad. And who are they up against?
Initially, the main opposition was the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. They were mostly secular, aiming for democracy, and had backing from the West. But over time, Islamist rebel groups, a lot of them supported by Turkey, started gaining more power. Eventually, they formed the Syrian National Army, or SNA.
So we've got Assad's forces, the FSA, and now this SNA, all fighting for control. And where do the extremist groups like ISIS fit into all of this?
Ah, yes, the extremist groups. So we've got Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, a former al-Qaeda affiliate, and then there's the infamous Islamic State, or ISIS. They make an already messy situation even more complicated.
And then there's the Kurds, right? They've been crucial in the fight against ISIS.
You got it. The Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG, and the Women's Protection Units, the YPJ, joined up to form the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, with U.S. support. They've been incredibly effective against ISIS.
So it's not just about beating Assad. You've got all these groups with their own agendas and constantly shifting alliances. It's like a giant game of Risk, but with real lives at stake.
That's a perfect analogy. And to complicate things even further, they're not always fighting each other. There's this enemy of my enemy dynamic at play. Groups with totally different ideologies will team up against a common foe, even if they don't trust each other at all.
So everyone's kind of frenemies, only united by who they hate the most at any given moment. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and that's what makes this recent rebel offensive so interesting. It's not just about who's fighting who, but also this major power shift.
Okay, so things were kind of stuck in a stalemate for a while, right? What changed? How did the rebels manage to pull this stunning victory in Aleppo? Did Assad just forget to lock the city gates or something?
Not quite. There are a few things that created this perfect storm for Assad's forces. Firstly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine seriously weakened their position in Syria. They had to pull out troops and resources to focus on the conflict closer to home.
So Putin's gamble in Ukraine is biting him back, even as far away as Syria. Wild.
It is. It's like a global ripple effect. And it's not just Russia. Iran, another big supporter of Assad, is also distracted. They're busy backing their allies in the axis of resistance, and there's this potential conflict with Israel brewing. Even Hezbollah, their main group in Lebanon, has taken hits from clashes with Israel.
Wow, so it's like Assad's allies are dropping like flies. But how did the rebels, HTS specifically, take advantage of this?
Well, HTS, seeing this opportunity, they played it smart. They've been quietly training and arming, preparing for a big move.
So while everyone else was busy fighting, they were training in the shadows, like some kind of ninja warrior squad, just waiting for the right moment.
Exactly. And when they struck, they smashed all expectations. Taking Aleppo in just 3 days was incredible. They doubled their territory, and they really hammered Assad's forces, capturing weapons, vehicles, even aircraft.
The report called it an achievement beyond even the most optimistic estimates. But wasn't this a team effort? Some pro-Turkey rebel groups who usually fight HTS joined in right.
You're right. The level of unity among the rebel groups is fascinating. Even factions with major ideological differences, like pro-Turkey groups and HTS, put aside their issues to fight against their common enemy, Assad.
A temporary truce born out of necessity. How long can that last, though? These groups have been at each other's throats for years. And what about the Kurds, caught in the crossfire?
That's a great point, and it brings us to the most interesting part of this whole story. The unpredictable future of Syria and what it means for the whole region.
Hang on. Gotta grab another coffee. This is intense. All right. I'm back, fully caffeinated, and ready for more. We've talked about this surprise rebel offensive, but feels like we're just scratching the surface, right?
You got it. Syria right now is incredibly volatile. There's a lot going on, and trying to guess what happens next is almost impossible.
Okay, well, let's try and break it down. You mentioned Russia, one of Assad's most powerful allies, has been weakened by the war in Ukraine. What does that actually look like on the ground in Syria?
Well, it's not like Russia just packed up and abandoned Assad completely. They still have some presence, mostly at their naval base in Tartus and their air base in Hymim, but their ability to project power definitely taken a hit.
So fewer troops, less equipment, basically less muscle to flex.
Precisely. And maybe even more importantly, they've lost a lot of political influence. The war in Ukraine has been a huge miscalculation for Putin, both at home and internationally. He's facing opposition within Russia, economic sanctions from the West, and more people see Russia as a rogue state.
So basically, Putin's got his hands full with his own problems. This has to be a huge blow for Assad, losing his main backer right when the rebels are gaining ground. It's almost Shakespearean, like the walls are closing in.
It's definitely a major challenge for the regime. And remember, it's not just Russia that's pulling back. Iran, Assad's other major ally, is also facing its own set of problems.
You mentioned they're focused on the axis of resistance and a potential conflict with Israel. Can you unpack that a bit more? I'm still trying to wrap my head around all these alliances.
Sure. The axis of resistance is this kind of loose alliance made up of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, and some Shia militias in Iraq. They see themselves as this united front against Western influence and Israeli dominance in the region. Iran's been pouring resources into this network, giving them money and military support.
So they see Israel as their main adversary.
Yeah, and tensions between Iran and Israel have been getting worse for years. There's been a bunch of clashes, especially in Syria, where Iran is trying to establish a permanent military presence, and in Lebanon, where Hezbollah is a big threat to Israel's security. It's a really volatile situation.
And on top of all of that, Iran is dealing with its own internal problems, right?
Yeah.
We've seen those widespread protests against the regime.
Exactly. Iran's economy is struggling under the weight of sanctions, and people are increasingly unhappy with how the government's handling the economy, social issues, and human rights. All of this internal pressure makes it harder for them to project power abroad.
So both Russia and Iran are stretched thin, trying to juggle multiple conflicts and internal problems. It's almost like they're playing a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole, and they're starting to lose. This must be a golden opportunity for groups like HTS, right?
Precisely. HTS has been really clever about recognizing this power vacuum and stepping into the void. Remember that stunning offensive in Aleppo we talked about? That wasn't just a lucky break.
That was like they came out of nowhere and just dominated. But you're saying there was more to it?
Absolutely. HTS has been playing the long game. While other groups were going for those quick wins, they were solidifying their control over Idlib province, building up their military, and making alliances with other rebel groups.
So they were like the quiet kid in the corner that everyone underestimates, but who's secretly been training to be a martial arts master. And when the time was right, bam, they unleashed their skills.
That's a great way to put it. And when that moment came, they were more than ready. They launched this well-coordinated offensive, took advantage of weaknesses in Assad's forces, and capitalized on the element of surprise. It was a masterclass in strategy and execution.
The report even mentioned that some pro-Turkey rebel groups, who normally clash with HTS, joined the fight. Is that just a temporary alliance, or is something bigger going on here?
It's mainly tactical, driven by the shared goal of taking down Assad, but it also shows how things are changing within the Syrian opposition. Years of fighting a common enemy have given them the sense of shared purpose, even among groups with big ideological differences. It's like they finally realize they're stronger together.
So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for now. But can this alliance really hold, especially with all that infighting among the rebels? It's hard to trust someone who was trying to kill you a week ago, right?
That's the big question. The longer this conflict drags on, the more likely those internal divisions are to resurface. And then there's the question of how Turkey will react. They're a major wild card in all of this.
Right. Turkey has been a major player in this whole thing, backing certain rebel groups and even launching their own military operations inside Syria. What's in it for them? What are they trying to achieve?
For Turkey, it comes down to security. They share this long border with Syria, and they've been massively affected by the conflict. Millions of Syrian refugees have fled to Turkey, stretching resources thin and causing social tensions. That's a huge humanitarian crisis.
And let's not forget that Turkey's been really worried about the Kurdish groups in Syria.
Absolutely. Turkey sees the Syrian Kurdish YPG militia as just an extension of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. They've been fighting an insurgency inside Turkey for decades. For them, any kind of Kurdish autonomy in Syria is a direct threat to their national security. It's like having a potential enemy right on your doorstep.
So they're worried about a potential Kurdish state popping up right on their border. Understandable, given the history between Turkey and the Kurds.
Exactly. And they've shown they're willing to use military force to prevent that. They've launched several incursions into northern Syria, attacking Kurdish-held areas and establishing a buffer zone along their border. It's a really complex and delicate situation.
So Turkey's trying to juggle all these competing interests in Syria, supporting the rebels against Assad, containing the Kurds, and securing their own border. It's like they're solving a Rubik's Cube while riding a unicycle on a tightrope.
That's a great way to put it. And their actions have a huge impact on how the conflict unfolds. They've given weapons and training to various rebel groups, including some with ties to extremism, and their interventions have made this already tangled web of alliances and rivalries even more complicated.
So Turkey's a key player, but also a wild card. It seems like their choices could really shape the future of Syria. And to make things even more interesting, they've got elections coming up soon, right? Could that affect their involvement in Syria?
It's definitely possible. Those upcoming elections could lead to a change in Turkey's foreign policy, depending on who wins. If the current government stays in power, we can probably expect them to continue with their current approach in Syria.
But what if the opposition wins? Could we see a completely different approach to the Syrian conflict?
That's where it gets really unpredictable. The opposition has criticized the government's actions in Syria, saying it's too interventionist and has destabilized the region. They've said they want a more cautious approach, focusing on diplomacy and dialogue.
So the fate of Syria could actually depend, at least in part, on an election in Turkey.
That's crazy to think about. It really highlights how interconnected all these conflicts are and how events in one country can ripple across borders and even continents. It's like a giant, messy spider web of geopolitics. Exactly. And we haven't even talked about the potential for ISIS to make a comeback, which is a whole other layer of complexity. Remember, we thought they were defeated, but the report warned about them using this power vacuum created by the recent rebel offensive to their advantage. How serious of a threat is that?
You're right. I thought we were done with ISIS. But this report makes it seem like they're much more resilient and adaptable than we thought. Let's unpack that in the next part, because I think we're about to enter a whole new level of oh no territory. All right, so we're stepping into the deep end of oh no territory now. We're talking ISIS. I thought we had wiped them out back in 2019. Their caliphate. It was gone, right?
Yeah, the physical territory they held in Syria and Iraq, that was dismantled. But the thing about ISIS is they don't get up that easily. They didn't just vanish. They went underground, broke into smaller cells, and adapted.
So they're like cockroaches. You squash one and a bunch more pop up.
It's not a bad analogy. Instead of trying to control territory, they've switched tactics. Now they're focused on being this disruptive force. They're launching attacks, assassinations, bombings, while they spread their propaganda and recruit online. It's a whole new ballgame.
So they traded their army for laptops, basically. That's going to be way harder to combat an enemy that's all over the place and hiding in the digital world.
It is, and what's worse is they're using all the chaos from the Syrian conflict to their advantage. It's this awful cycle. The war helps ISIS to grow, and then ISIS makes the whole region even more unstable.
And the report even mentioned sleeper cells in Damascus. That's scary. ISIS operating right under Assad's nose, potentially able to attack right in the capital.
Yeah, it's a really worrying possibility. If a big attack happened in Damascus, think of the panic, the chaos. It would hit Assad's regime hard and create this power vacuum that ISIS could use to get back into the region.
So Assad's already got his hands full with the rebel offensive and his allies backing off. Now you throw a resurgent ISIS into the mix. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire that's already out of control.
It is. And here's the really scary part. Even if everyone else in this conflict somehow found a way to make peace, ISIS would still be there, lurking in the background, waiting for any sign of weakness. They thrive on chaos.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. HTS gaining power, the Kurds struggling for survival, Turkey playing this complicated game, and now ISIS making a comeback. It's a lot to process. What should our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the main thing to remember is that conflicts like this are never simple. There are no easy answers, no clear good guys and bad guys. It's this messy mix of competing interests, shifting alliances, and everyone fighting for power or just to survive.
Yeah, it really shows you how complicated the world is. To understand these conflicts, you can't just look at the headlines, you got to dig deeper.
Exactly. And I think it also shows you that even when things are really bad, there's still hope. The Syrian people are so resilient, those fighting for a better future, all the humanitarian groups working to help. Even in the middle of all this suffering, people are still fighting for good.
It's been a tough topic, but so important. Expert speaker, thank you for walking us through this. I think we've all learned a lot. And to everyone listening, keep learning about these complicated issues. The world needs more people who are informed and care enough to ask tough questions. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Until next time.